Between 1619 and 1867, more than 12 million human beings were forcibly transported across the Atlantic Ocean in what became the largest forced migration in human history. But here's what most people don't realize. This wasn't just about slavery. This was about how 3 entire continents were reshaped forever. In the next several minutes, you'll discover how a triangle of trade routes generated more wealth than entire kingdoms, why the journey across the Atlantic became known as the Middle Passage of Death, and how the economic impact of this system still influences our world today. But first, to truly understand the Atlantic slave trade, we need to look back to how it all began. The year is 1492. Columbus has just reached the Americas, and the age of exploration explodes into a frenzy. European powers, Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands, race to stake their claims on vast new lands. But there's a problem. The success of these colonies relies entirely on labor, intense, grueling labor to plant, tend, and harvest the lucrative crops that will make these empires rich. Initially, colonists turned to the indigenous peoples of the Americas, but the arrival of Europeans brings with it a catastrophic wave of disease: smallpox, measles, influenza, diseases to which indigenous populations have no immunity. The results are devastating. In some regions, as much as 90% of the population is lost within a generation. Conflict, war, and forced labor drive the numbers even lower. The colonial dream of endless fields of sugar, tobacco, and cotton seems impossible, unless a new source of labor can be found. Now, here's where the story takes a dark turn that would reshape global economics forever. European eyes shift toward West Africa, where systems of slavery already exist, but in forms very different from what comes next. In many African societies, slavery means prisoners of war, debt servitude, or criminals sentenced for specific periods of time. What European traders introduce is a new, industrial-scale system, a relentless conveyor belt of human trafficking that will last for centuries. Sugar becomes the catalyst. In the Caribbean, sugar plantations are soon described as white gold. The demand in Europe is insatiable. Sugar, once a rare luxury, becomes a staple in European diets. A single plantation with enough labor can generate more revenue than entire European towns. The profit margins are staggering. Portuguese records from the 1600s show that sugar plantation owners could see returns of 300% or more on their investments. Fortunes are made overnight, but at an unimaginable human cost. The drive for profit sets in motion a machinery of suffering that will span oceans and generations. The Atlantic slave trade operates on what historians call the triangular trade, a 3-part journey that connects Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a cycle of human misery and economic gain. The first step: European ships leave ports like Liverpool, Bristol, Nantes, and Lisbon, their holds packed with manufactured goods. Textiles, firearms, metal tools, and alcohol are among the most prized cargo. These goods are not meant for sale in the Americas, but for barter along the African coast. Arriving off the shores of West Africa, European traders rarely venture inland. Instead, they anchor their ships and wait. African intermediaries, rulers, merchants, and warlords bring captives to the coast. Some have been taken in wars or raids. Others are victims of kidnapping and violence. The goods are exchanged for people, men, women, and children, torn from their homes and communities. But what happened next during the ocean crossing was so horrific that ship captains often refused to keep detailed records. The Middle Passage, the journey from Africa to the Americas, becomes infamous as a floating hell. Human beings are crammed into the lower decks of ships, chained together in spaces so tight that many cannot even sit up. The stench is overwhelming. Disease spreads rapidly. Dysentery, smallpox, and other illnesses run rampant. Food and water are scarce. The journey lasts 6 to 10 weeks, but for many it feels like an eternity. Ship records from the British archives reveal mortality rates between 15% and 20% during the crossing. On some voyages, nearly half of all people aboard die before reaching the Americas. Historians estimate that between 1.8 and 2.4 million people died during the Middle Passage alone, not including the untold numbers who perished before reaching the coast or after arrival. Yet, despite the horror, the trade continues, driven by insatiable demand and astronomical profits. The ships finally arrive in the Americas: Charleston, New Orleans, Rio de Janeiro, Havana. Here, the survivors are sold at auction, their families often separated forever. Plantation owners buy men, women, and children like livestock, sending them to fields where they will labor from before dawn until after sunset. The work is brutal. Sugar, tobacco, and cotton are unforgiving crops, and the overseers are merciless. Completing the triangle, the ships are loaded with the fruits of this labor: sugar, tobacco, cotton, coffee, and rum, and set sail back to Europe. The entire cycle takes 12 to 18 months. The profits are immense. By 1750, the Atlantic slave trade represents about 80% of Britain's foreign income. Liverpool alone sends more than 5,000 ships to Africa between 1695 and 1807. The wealth generated by this trade funds the rise of cities, the building of grand estates, the expansion of industries, and the transformation of entire economies. But the story doesn't end with economics. The Atlantic slave trade fundamentally transforms 3 continents: Africa, Europe, and the Americas. In Africa, the relentless demand for captives fuels centuries of warfare and social upheaval. Kingdoms such as Oyo, Dahomey, and Asante grow powerful by participating in the trade, while others, like the Kingdom of Congo, are devastated by depopulation and chaos. Some regions lose as much as 50% of their population. The scars remain to this day, visible in the demographic and political landscapes of West and Central Africa. In Europe, the wealth generated by the slave trade becomes the foundation for the Industrial Revolution. Profits from sugar, cotton, and tobacco flow into banks, factories, railways, and universities. Many of the grand buildings in cities like Liverpool and Bristol are built with slave trade money. Even today, the legacy of that wealth is visible in the architecture, institutions, and cultural memory of these cities. In the Americas, slave labor becomes the engine of entire economies. By 1750, enslaved people produce about 70% of the world's sugar. In the United States, by 1860, nearly 4 million people are enslaved, representing about 16% of total national wealth. Brazil receives the largest number of enslaved Africans, about 40% of the total, shaping the culture, economy, and society of the country for centuries. Yet, in the face of unimaginable suffering, enslaved people resist. Over 400 shipboard rebellions are documented, and countless more acts of resistance take place on plantations and in communities throughout the Americas. Enslaved people preserve and transform their cultures, creating new forms of music, cuisine, language, and religious practice. The rhythms of Africa blend with European and indigenous traditions to create jazz, blues, samba, gospel, and more. Foods like gumbo, feijoada, and rice dishes reflect a fusion of cultures born of survival and resilience. Spiritual traditions such as Vodou, Candomblé, and the Black Church become sources of strength and identity. The Atlantic slave trade officially ends at different times in different places. Britain bans the trade in 1807, though slavery itself continues in its colonies for decades. The United States bans the importation of enslaved people in 1808, but slavery remains legal until 1865. Brazil, the last major destination, ends slavery in 1888 after years of struggle and resistance. In total, the system operates for nearly 400 years, transporting over 12 million people and generating wealth that helps fund the modern world. Today, memorials and museums around the world work to preserve this history and honor those who suffered. The National Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C., the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool, and Casa dos Escravos in Senegal are just a few of the places dedicated to remembrance and education. These sites remind us that the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade is not just a story of the past, it is a part of the present. Understanding this history isn't just about looking back. It's about recognizing how historical injustices, racism, inequality, and exploitation shape the world we live in today. The wealth created by the slave trade helped build nations and cities, but it also left deep scars that are still felt by millions. By learning about the past, we equip ourselves to better understand our present and to work toward a more just and equitable future. If you found these insights into the Atlantic slave trade eye-opening, consider exploring more about this crucial period in world history. Which aspects of this story surprised you most? Reflect on how this legacy continues to influence societies around the globe. Remember, by uncovering and acknowledging the truth, we honor the memory of those who endured, resisted, and ultimately shaped the world we live in today.